All right, so I think we're ready to begin. So first of all, let me go over to my terminal here. And you remember in the previous sessions we've set up our web server, we've set up Apache, and one of the things we did is we created a directory called framework. And what I'm going to do is, let's just do this. First, I'm going to move the .htaccess file into this directory. And then I am going to rm, which means remove the entire framework directory. I don't need that, and I'll remove the index.php as well. Okay, so all there is in this folder now, well, should be, oh, there we go. Okay, so all that is in this folder now, besides the Git repository that we set up in the first session, is the .htaccess file. So everything else is empty, and for all intents and purposes, you can think of this directory as being completely empty except for the .htaccess file. So let's take a look at that. This is fundamental to how we are making the MVC controller work. And what this does is it says anything that goes to any URL on this site is going to hit index.php in this directory. And that is what Thunder Cleast was asking earlier. So if I go into, well, first I have to create an index.php, so let's just do that real quick. I'm just going to make it a very simple file here, just so that you can see. So if I go to the root URL here, you'll see that obviously it pulls up that page, but notice that even if I put in something silly like that, it's still going to pull up exactly that page. And even if it's something with a directory path, it's still going to pull up that page. That's what the .htaccess file does. It makes it so that anything we go to, any URL at all, it is going to go to index.php, this file right here. And so that, in fact, will be the main controller of our framework. So once again, here's the htaccess file. It's very simple. Just to recap, the first line, rewrite engine on, just indicates that we're going to be using mod rewrite, which is the module for Apache that makes it possible for you to rewrite URLs. And when I say rewrite a URL, that means to take a URL that someone typed that maybe looks like this and change it as if they had just typed this, while at the same time maintaining the knowledge of what was typed so that it can be used later on. The next line here, these rewrite condition lines, let me just think for a second. File and directory, the -f is file and the -d is directory. And what we're saying here is not files and not directories for the file names. And I'm pretty sure, I'm 99% sure, that what that is specifically saying is don't allow direct access to files or directories. So even if you put in a path name for what you know is a file that exists, this would prevent that from happening. And just for the fun of it, let's just test that real quick. So I'm going to create a file called test.txt. This is a test. Now I push Control D to save that file. And now we're going to edit the .htaccess, remove the line that said file, and let's just see what happens if I go to /test.txt. Okay, so obviously that's not what it is. I'll look it up later. I do know that there is a reason that I do that, and not directory, not file. And what happens if we take this out altogether? Well, then it's saying that anything that's typed in is going to just go to index.php. So right off the top of my head, I can't think of why I need those two options. And in fact, for this, maybe we actually don't. So let me just, yeah, it's probably going to work just fine. Okay. All right. I'll probably get to that in the next session. I'll do a little research between now and then. There is a reason I've used that before, so we'll get into that. But it's certainly not going to matter right now. Right now what we're saying is anything that's typed in, it's going to index.php, and that's what we want. So I'll research that a little bit more later. All right, so again, the .htaccess, this is the rewrite rules where we're specifying how a URL is getting rewritten. Now this line right here, what this says is that if you go to a valid directory that does not have an index page in it, like index.html or index.php, you will not be able to see an index of all of the files in that directory. And that's useful for security reasons, because if you have a directory like /images and someone just goes to that directory, then they'll be able to see, you know, all of the images you have there, or whatever the case might be, whether it's a scripts directory where you have JavaScript files or whatever. You generally don't want people to see an index of all of the files in a directory. You want to control that process. And again, because we have this line, the rewrite rule, it's probably somewhat redundant right now, but that'll play a role later on. All right, so let's go ahead and install MySQL. So again, we're going to use apt-get install, and now it might just be MySQL or it might be MySQL 5, the version number. So what I'm going to do in order to make sure that I do this right, first of all, I'm going to increase the size of my terminal window. Okay, I'm going to type apt cache search MySQL. That's going to search for all the different packages that contain the word MySQL. That's a little bit too long, so I'm going to grep for the word server. If I type grep-i, that means I'm doing a case-insensitive grep for server. And grep MySQL also. Okay, I'm going to scroll up here and see. Okay, MySQL-server will be sufficient. So if I do an apt-get install MySQL server, that'll be what I want. So apt-get install MySQL server. Okay, so it's going to ask me for a root password, which I'll just put in here. Now, notice it's also installing packages that say MySQL client. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but the client is what allows you to talk to the server. And yes, the question that was asked right here, and the answer is yes, the index file replaces the normal index of that you would see if there wasn't an index file there. And you can configure your web server to specify what you want the index file to be, whether it's going to be index.html, index.php, or some variation of something else. So I'm actually going to do one thing real quick here. I want to reinstall the MySQL server. Okay, well that didn't quite work the way I wanted. Give me 1 second here, hold on. Okay, so can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So I just changed my MySQL root password to Carl. And that way I don't mind sharing with all of you so that you can actually see how this works. So here we go. So if I type MySQL -u root and -p, this will prompt me for my password. I'll just type in Carl, I hit enter, and now I am inside the MySQL server as root. So there's a few things I need to explain to you. First of all, MySQL is a database system. This is where you're going to store whatever information it is that you're going to have, whether usernames and passwords, or there's a lot of different information. It could be, let's just take, for example, Reddit. So Reddit's going to have databases where you're going to have the content of every post is going to exist in a database. There's going to be probably databases of all the different subreddits and so on. So basically anything that you're going to store as data that's going to change over time, you're going to put it into a database, which is different than files that are going to be on the server that are not going to change. You're going to be using a database for information and data that is updated or changes on a regular basis. People adding comments, content getting added, whatever the case might be. So the first command that you should know in MySQL is show databases. Every time you type a command in MySQL, you end it with a semicolon. And what we see here is that we have 4 databases. Now, the first database, Information Schema, is a special database that has a lot of information related to the MySQL server itself. And with a little bit of creative database queries, you can actually get a lot of useful information from that table, including what all the different tables are, what all the different databases are. In fact, you can basically query everything about the database directly from Information Schema. And I'll show you how to do that shortly. The other databases you see is MySQL, Performance Schema, and Test. And these are all databases that come pre-installed. I didn't create a database called Test. It's just there, but we don't need it. So let's take a look at a database. If you want to use a specific database in MySQL, you type use followed by the name of the database. So in this case, we're going to say, let's say use MySQL. Now, if I say show tables, it's very similar to show databases, except now we're in a database and we want to look at the specific tables there are. So if I type show tables, and let me enlarge this. Okay, so we see these are all of the tables that are in the MySQL database. Think of a table like an Excel spreadsheet. It has columns and it has rows. That's the easiest way to think of a database table. And every column has a purpose. You can think of it as a header of the column. I'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, every column has its own unique purpose, and then you can have as many rows in the database as you want. So let's just take one of these for example. We have user. Now, if I say, now how do I look at what's actually in user? Well, first of all, let's use the describe command. If I type describe user, this will show me all of the different columns that are inside of this database table. Don't worry about everything. Now, I can't exactly draw a square here, but if you can imagine me drawing a square, don't worry about everything off to the right here. Just worry about everything field, everything under the field column. So these are the fields we have in this particular database table. We have host, user, password, and so on. Now, if I want, I can look at everything in the table. I can say select star everything from user, semicolon, and there you go. And I'll have to scroll through it, and you'll notice it's very hard to read. That's because I'm looking at every single column. It would work if I had an 80-inch monitor, which I don't. So ideally, I want to look at only a few things at a time. So let's look at host, user, and password. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to say select host, user, password from users. Oops. From user, not users. And there you can see it's a whole lot easier to read. And you can also see what I was referring to when I was talking about each column having a purpose, a name, whatever you want to call it. And then you have as many rows as possible, very similar to a spreadsheet. So what we're looking at here are the basic access rules for how someone can use this database. And what we're saying here is that if you're on the machine, like I am right now, and you are logging in with the username root, the password you would use is not this, but this is an encrypted form of the password. Now watch this. If I say select password, Carl, notice that what you see here, that this is exactly the same as this. That's because the password for this particular MySQL server, if you're root, is Carl. Now, this right here is, you don't need to worry about it too much, but basically we are running this on an Ubuntu machine. And that means that Ubuntu being a distribution that's based on Debian, these packages come set up in such a way that there are certain operations that certain system maintenance operations that are done using a different username called Debian sysmaint. And that's a great question as to what the default encryption for MySQL is. I actually don't know right off the top of my head. But MD5 is not encryption. And SHA-1 is not encryption. I should say not reversible encryption. If you create something using an SHA-1 or an MD5, it can't be reversed. These are called hashes. A hash is when you create something where you can confirm what it was to a very high degree of accuracy, but you can't reverse it. Now, if I say this, if I say select SHA-1 Carl, this is what the hash for SHA-1 looks like. Now, if anyone has this, they will not be able to plug this into some kind of a program or algorithm and output Carl. It's not encrypted. It doesn't have a key or a passphrase or anything. It's a hash, and that means that it's theoretically possible that I could type SHA-1 something else, although I have no idea what that something else might be, but it's theoretically possible I could type SHA-1 something else and get exactly that stream, although it's extremely unlikely. But just to demonstrate, and the reason it's extremely unlikely is because of how many characters this is. Now just to demonstrate that, there's a command in MySQL, a function called Substring. And I believe it works like this. Let me just... Yeah. Okay, TE. So what Substring does is it allows you to select part of a string. In this case, I'm using the word test as the string, and I'm saying I want to start at the first character and grab 2 characters. So let's go ahead and replace the word test with SHA-1 Carl. So now I'm only capturing the first 2 characters of the hash. And in fact, I'm only going to grab the first character, so D. Now think about D as a very short version of the hash. It's theoretically possible I could type SHA-1 something else. Let's just say test. Okay, that got me A. But if I tried a few creative combinations, I would eventually probably find my way back to D again. And that's the idea of a hash. You have a very high likelihood that if the hash matches, then you have a match for what you were looking for. So for example, if I say enter your password and the hash comes out exactly like this, then I can say with an extremely high degree of certainty that the password that was typed in was in fact Carl, and therefore it was the correct password. Now, in general, when you are storing things like passwords, you don't want to store the passwords in plain text. You don't want to have a database with a column called passwords where the actual passwords people use on your site are stored. Rather, what you do is you store the passwords as hashes. That way, if an attacker were ever able to get access to those passwords, they would not be able to actually figure out what people's passwords were. And even if your site didn't matter a great deal, it's still possible that people use the same password on many different sites, and sometimes a minor site gets hacked, those passwords get stolen, and then it's enough information, especially when people put their email addresses, in order to then figure out what people's passwords are on other sites. So that's how that works. All right, so let's go ahead and, now that you've seen the basics of MySQL, very basics, let's go ahead and actually create a database. So we're going to create a database, let's just call it framework. So you put create database followed by the name of the database, a semicolon, enter, you're done. You now have a database and you can now put tables in it. So creating tables is a bit more tricky. You have to come up with a name for the table, and you have to come up with the name for each column and the data type of each column. Now the data type is something that we'll go into later, so I'm going to make this really easy. We're going to create a table called, let's just say, let's have a table with usernames and passwords. So first of all, I need to type use framework in order to make it so I'm actually in this database that I just created. And now I can say create table users, and I put a parentheses, and then I'm going to put all the details, and then close parentheses and a semicolon. So let's go ahead and do that. First, I'm just going to put the opening parentheses. Now I could either type it out right here, or I can type it in multiple lines by hitting enter. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit enter, and now I'm going to specify the column name. So I'm just going to, for right now, have two very simple columns. Username. Now I have to give it a data type. There are a lot of different data types which we'll get into later, but for right now, to make this really easy, we're just going to use text as the data type, which just means you can put whatever you want in that column, more or less. Put a comma, and then the next column we'll just say password. We'll call that text. We'll set that to text, I should say. And then we put our semicolon, and we're done. Now we have a database called framework, and we have a table in framework called users. Pretty simple. You could create as many additional columns as you want. You can also add columns after the fact and delete columns after the fact. For example, if I say alter table users, add column, something, text, now I have a new column called something. And I can delete a column just as easily. I believe remove column something. And drop, let's try delete. Let's see, alter table users, add column, remove column, should be remove column something, drop column. There you go. Okay, so it's add column, drop column. It's somewhat intuitive, so it's not too hard to figure out. Okay, so that's how you add and remove columns to a database table. So now how do you actually put something in? Okay, so you use the insert keyword in order to actually put stuff into your database. So we can say insert into users, where users is the name of the database table that we're going to put data into. We put a parentheses. Here we put the columns. Then we type the word values, a parentheses, and then we put the values of what's going to go there. So real simple. We're going to put username, password, and we'll put the values of, let's just say, test and test. So I'm going to put quotes to indicate that it's a string of text, and there you go. And now let's just put a couple others in just so you can see that. We'll have test 2 and test 3. If I now say select star from users, you'll see the entries that we just put in. Okay, so I think now what I want to do is show you how to actually use PHP to interact with MySQL. And yeah, let's do that. So first of all, this is what's nice about Screen. I'm not going to lose my open MySQL session. I'll just call this MySQL. I'll create a new screen by doing Control A and then C. And I'll just call this PHP. I'll go into here and I'll edit the index.php file. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to do one other thing. The .vimrc file in your home directory, and the tilde here just means your home directory, is where you can put commands that Vim will execute every time it starts. So I'm going to make a few modifications here. There you go. Whoops. And what those two commands will do, just simply make sure that when I hit tab, it doesn't go over 8 spaces, which I don't like. Oops. Okay. All right, so okay, why did it? Oh, because I edited my vimrc wrong. There we go. Oh, set. I need the word set. Okay. And I need a colon. There we go. And set shift width equals 4. Equals 4. There we go. Okay, so that means now that whenever I hit tab, it's going to go over 4 spaces, which will save me some time. All right, so here, remember, any URL we go to is going to hit this particular PHP script, this index.php. So there's a few ways that I could actually do this. I could show you the way that you used to do it, which is somewhat deprecated now, and then later on show you the more modern ways of doing it. And I think that's actually what I'm going to do because it's a little bit more procedural and I think a little easier to understand, at least to get started. So that's what we're going to do. So this method is somewhat deprecated. It's not used. It shouldn't be used anymore in a real professional situation, but if you're just learning, it's fine. And I'll show you later on, when we get into it, I'll show you the more proper way of doing this. But basically, the first thing you do is you can create a variable, we'll call it MySQL, and set it equal to MySQL connect, and here's where you're going to put in the details of how to connect to your MySQL server. Now, MySQL_connect is not a function that is considered good practice today, but again, because it's just a matter of learning how to do it, it's fine. Later on, I'll get into more modern ways of doing it. They're a little bit more complex, so I think this is just an easier way to go. So the first thing you have to do is you have to specify the server. Now, what's great about databases like MySQL is that it doesn't have to be on the same machine. I could have a totally different server somewhere totally different. And yes, to answer that question, it would be, except for the fact that then I'm getting into some object-oriented details. MySQL I believe connect or arrow connect. that I don't want to get into yet, and I know there are aliases for that, but I don't want to get into that yet, just because I think it might just be a little bit more complex than it needs to be, and it won't be a very big jump, but I want to at least use these first, just because I think it makes sense. We'll get into that soon enough. Right now, I'm going on the assumption that a lot of people who are watching this probably don't have much object-oriented experience, and MySQLi as well as PDO are heavily object-oriented based, and the MySQL underscore functions are very procedural, and so I just think it's a little easier, at least for right now. So the first thing we do here is we're going to specify the host. Now in this case it's localhost, which means it's on the machine that we're on. But what is great about MySQL is that it doesn't have to be. I could have a server 1,000 miles away from this server with an IP address, and I could actually put in that IP address. And I could then have all of my data on one server and have my web application on a totally different server. And in fact, that is what is generally done when you have a company that has any significant amount of traffic and data. You have database servers, you have web servers, and in many cases you have entire machines dedicated to it, but at the very least you're probably going to have virtual machines dedicated to it. So you'll have a virtual machine dedicated to your database, another dedicated to your web server, and so on. Yeah, that's true. In most cases it's not 1,000 miles away, but it is a different server. Although there are times when it might be. Alright, so the next thing is you need to specify your username, and again, I'm going to be getting into good practice later, but right now it's more important that you understand the basics. This is not good practice for many different reasons, but right now let me explain a few things. The first is you should not access your MySQL database as root from your web application. You should set up a MySQL user specific to your web application and limit it to only have access to the databases and tables that it should have access to. The reason I'm not doing that is just simply because the amount of time it would take to explain how to do that would take away from the lesson. And the next thing that you don't do is you don't put the password of your database in plain text in your script, like I'm doing here. And what you would ideally do is you would actually have some function here that would be something like, let's say, get password or something, which via a complicated process would obtain the password in such a way that a hacker, were they to get access to this source code, would not just instantly be able to see, oh, the password is Carl, and now I can get into the database. And the last thing you don't do is you don't have a password that's 4 characters in size, made of only lowercase characters. So again, part of this is I want to show you good practices, and right now that's going to be a do what I say, not what I do, but only because these good practices and good security is something that takes a lot of time to learn, and the details of it are quite involved, and right now I don't want to detract from the learning experience by getting into all of that, but we will. That will come up eventually. The next thing that generally you want to do, again, I'm somewhat describing an older process. This isn't really so much how it's done anymore, but at the end of your script you'll have a MySQL close where you'll close the MySQL that you opened. So what we're doing here is we're opening up a MySQL connection, then we're going to do whatever we're going to do here, and then we're going to close it when we're done. Fairly self-explanatory. So now let's create a query and demonstrate how to actually see that it worked. So we're going to create a query here. I'll just call this query, and we'll say select star from. Now there's 2 ways that I could do this. There's a function where I could specify what database we're using, but the easiest way to do that is to actually specify the database in the query. And the way you do that is you type in the name of the table or the database that you want, then a period, and then the name of the table. Now, let's just say that I couldn't remember right off the top of my head what I named the table. That's what's great about using screen. I just Control A, P, and now I can see the name of the table is users, and then Control A, N. Remember, P is for previous, N is for next, and I'm back here, and I can see that it's users. So being able to switch between screens like that can save time. All right, so there's the query. And now what we'll do is we're going to save the result of that query into an array. We'll call that array rows, and we'll say that rows is equal to MySQL fetch array. This is a function that will simply take what you see here and construct an actual usable array in the PHP code that we can use. So, like so. And last, in order to actually see that it worked, I'm going to type print R, which is short for print array, which is a very useful function. You'll definitely be using that function a lot if you do anything in PHP, and you'll be using its equivalents in whatever language you are using in order to actually just dump the contents of an array. And there we go. Now, whenever you are working with PHP, it's often nice to check the syntax to make sure that you didn't make any mistakes along the way. In Vim, one thing that you can do is you can type :!, and then PHP -NL, and the -NL means that we're going to do a syntax check to make sure we don't have any errors or typos without actually running the code. So the code is not going to be ran, it's just going to be checked. And then a %, which specifies that the percent can just be thought of as all of this. And then we hit enter, and it tells us no errors. So that's good to know, and now we can go ahead and run it. All right, so localhost root Carl. So time to do a little bit of troubleshooting, it looks like. So first of all, right, we know the query was right. Let's go ahead and check our PHP log real quick. Call to undefined function MySQL connect. Okay, well there you go. And the reason for that is because we have not installed MySQL for PHP. So we do apt cache search MySQL. MySQL grep PHP. See what that finds us. There you go. PHP 5-MySQL. So we'll install that. PHP 5 MySQL. And now let's try. Okay, it still didn't work, but why not? Still undefined function MySQL connect. It'd be funny if it's actually so deprecated that they totally took it out. I don't think that's the case, though. That's one I did, right? PHP 5-MySQL. All right, let's try that one. I might have to restart Apache, but let's just do that real quick. MySQL. Yeah. All right, let's try restarting Apache. Okay, there we go. That worked. So I now know that the MySQL function worked properly, the connect function, but we've got an error here. So let's see, MySQL fetch array. Yeah. Before we can store the result into an array, we actually have to run the query. MySQL_query is the command that's going to run the query. So we specify, we're basically creating a new variable called $result. We're storing in it, well, this is a little hard to explain what we're storing in it. When you run this function, MySQL query, it's going to actually query the database for what you see here, and it's going to save it in a special kind of MySQL query object that PHP understands but is not human readable. So in order to actually interpret that, we need to use the $result in our MySQL fetch array. So I save that, go up here, hit enter, and there you go. Now it works. And in general, when you're going to be using any database system, one of the first things you're going to do is actually make sure that your connection and everything works. It would be horrible if you write a lot of code and then you find out that nothing works and you spend hours troubleshooting only to find out that you didn't set up your database correctly. You could even have written all of the correct code. And so it's important to test as you develop. That's extremely important no matter what it is that you're doing. So, just to answer Thunder's question, I'm not sure if I answered it yet or not, but the reason is that just as Apache has modules like there's mod security, which is a module that you have to install separately for Apache, PHP is the same way. There's modules for PHP that you have to install separate from PHP itself, and the MySQL module is one such example of that. All right, so let's see here. All right, so everyone should see here that, let me just shrink this and go to view source. So this is what the output of the MySQL fetch array looks like. The query select star from framework.users will produce this result when we run this code. Now notice that you have username and you have 0 and you also have 1 and password. The reason is that the MySQL fetch array will give you both a numeric way to access the data as well as by name. And to show you how that works, actually let's put it down here. The username is, and now here we want to put what the username is relative to this data we just got. And in this case, what we can do is we can just say $rows username, like so. And if I refresh this page, you'll see that. Now let's go over here to our database, and I'm going to show you how you can change the data. Now keep in mind, every query that you can type in the MySQL interface, you can also run as a PHP command. Updates and additions and even creating entire tables you can do. So here, let's go ahead and change this. So first of all, I'm going to delete everything from framework.users. And you don't need a star, you just delete from. And now I'm going to insert, oh, that's a good question. The reason is because by calling the function once, I'm only grabbing the first row. I would actually have to create a while loop in order to go through and grab everything, and I'll show you how to do that. So for right now, I'm just actually focusing on one row. Oops. There. Okay, so now our entire table contains only one row with user 1 and pass 1. And so if I refresh the page, notice that now it says the username is user 1. And so you should immediately begin to get an appreciation for how the content in the database can affect your program, your script, because as that data changes, then the output from your program is going to change, and so you can start to see the relation. And if you have a complex site with a lot of different content, and that content is being pulled from the database, you can start to get a feel for how your scripting, in this case PHP, is interfacing with the database, and the data is kept separate from the programming code itself. So that's something that I wanted to make sure was conveyed in this session. All right, so let's see, what should we get into next? All right, so let's talk about how to grab more than one result. So let's go ahead and insert a new value. We'll say user2 and pass2. Now we can do this. I'm just going to enclose this whole thing into a while loop. Assuming I'm doing that right. We'll find out very shortly. And I'm also going to echo a new line character just so that it will not be a run-on sentence. And yeah, my while loop is in the wrong place. It should be right here. And the reason I know that is because I can see that I've created an infinite loop when refreshing my page didn't immediately give me the result that I wanted. There we go. Oops. I need a parentheses. There we go. And just do one more thing. Okay. And that's why you do the php-nl. So now I know that on line 7 I did something wrong. I just type :7, enter. I'm there. Parentheses, semicolon, done. And unfortunately I can't do a /n because this is HTML, so I need to do a BR tag. Okay, there you go. So now you see how to access the multiple rows. You just simply put this into the while loop. Specifically, this is grabbing the entire result in all of the different rows, and this is grabbing the next set of columns, in other words, the next full row for that result. That's how that works. Okay, let's see what to get into next. Anyone have any particular request? Yes, that's exactly right. Okay, that's actually a great question and something that we should review. So, .htaccess is unique to Apache. It's not a mod for Apache. It's built into Apache, but, or I should say, the functionality to have a .htaccess file is built into Apache. However, your Apache configuration file, which is in /etc/apache2/sites-enabled/ in this case, it's going to be whatever. If you only have one site, it's going to be whatever file is inside of sites enabled. If you edit that file, you'll notice that there's something called allow override, and this is specifically the configuration option that makes it possible for you to use .htaccess. So if it's set to all, as we have here, that means that your .htaccess file can override any of your settings. If you had it set to none, then your .htaccess file will do absolutely nothing. So that's how that works. And anytime you make a change to your Apache configuration, you need to always remember to restart Apache by using that command, which we don't need to actually run, but I want to show it to you. And just to recap a few of the different commands for MySQL, if you type /q like this, you can exit MySQL. If you want to get back into it, you type MySQL-u root-p. -u is short for username, -p is short for indicating that you're going to enter a password. Now, you could actually enter the password right there on the command line, and that'll work just fine. But generally, you're not going to do that because it gets logged in the history of commands you've typed, and so you'll just type -p, and then it'll prompt you for the password, and you get in that way. And yeah, the purpose of the course is to actually develop a framework, and as well as develop your own web applications. So a framework is a programmer's toolkit that allows you to build whatever it is you're trying to build, in this case web applications. So what we're going to be building in this course is an entire toolkit that you can use to build your own web applications, and in the process you'll understand the technology that goes into it. The main purpose of the course is to really teach web technology, everything from how servers work to how PHP works to MySQL, and there's so many different things involved. It's not just one technology. If you learn just Apache or just PHP or just MySQL, it is not nearly enough. There are at least a dozen or 2 dozen different technologies that you use on a daily basis when you're doing any kind of web development. And the nice thing is, you don't need to know all of them in great depth. You just need to know them to a high enough degree that you can manage. That's a good question. So PHP has a lot of things that are good for it and a lot of things that are bad for it. And the same is true with really every language. But one of the things that is bad about PHP is that the bar of entry is very low. In other words, you can have someone who knows absolutely nothing about programming, and they'll be able to write a PHP program, and it will be horrible, full of bugs, and impossible to maintain. And the reason that that is a problem is because if you're going out and hiring web developers, you can be looking for a PHP developer, as I've done, and you'll find someone who is a PHP developer, and finding someone who not only knows PHP but knows how to do it right is a very large challenge. So it's very easy to get into PHP, very easy, and that is both a strength and a weakness. And it's also the reason I'm using PHP in this course, because it's such an easy language to get into. It's so intuitive and easy to understand at the beginner level, and yeah, later on, I think it's good for someone to expand into other languages, but don't be misled. PHP is by itself a great language. The PHP developing community is enormous, and I couldn't count how many companies and websites use PHP. but it's not the only thing I use, but it is something I use. If I want to build a quick web application, I'd probably do it in PHP, because I'd be able to get it done probably quicker than most other languages, and I'd enjoy the process more, I think. So the product that we're going to be developing in general, it really shouldn't be thought of like that. I mean, the purpose of the course really is to teach web technology. So someone who is watching these lessons should be thinking in their mind that they want to learn how to develop web technology, web applications and frameworks, and whatever the case is, networking, wherever the goal is, that's what this is about as far as web technology goes. So it's not one specific thing that we're building. We're exploring a lot of technology in the process of building a web application framework, and also the idea of web application frameworks in general, and the MVC, Model View Controller, just to type that out, Model View Controller, is itself a significant topic that has applications in a lot of different areas, not just web applications. And that's what we're getting into slowly. In the last session we talked about, and as well as in this one, we talked about the index.php being a controller for anything that goes to the site, even a URL. You know, even if I type something like this, it's still going to the same index.php page, and that page can act as a router to direct the user wherever they need to go, and we'll get into how to do that later. And in this session, we talked a bit more about the model, to some degree, aspect of MVC, which really refers to the data. And in this case, we're using a MySQL database. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but the gist of MVC is that you have the data, you have what the end user sees, and you have the actual programming code separated, and each has its own purpose. So the controller is obviously controlling the entire process of what someone is, what happens with each session as someone visits the site and interacts with it. The view specifically handles what they see, what they're going to see on their web browser, and the model is specifically going to handle the data that's involved in the entire process. So once you have an understanding of these concepts, you can really build anything you want. In terms of, you can go out there and, to use your example, you can go build a website selling apples online or showing the latest news for your town, whatever the case might be. But there's a lot of different technologies that you need to learn, and that's kind of the idea. So rather than developing a course on PHP or MySQL, I'm really just kind of saying, okay, let's just start from scratch and build a complex web application framework. It'll take time, but in that process, you'll learn so much about the web technology that is involved. And it'll be somewhat of a crash course, but I think that it'll be very beneficial. So any other questions? If I wanted to develop Reddit, wow. I'm tempted to say PHP. All right, I'd say it'd be a toss-up between PHP, Perl, and Python. I might even say Ruby if it was a few years ago, but because a few years ago I was more fluent in Ruby. But it really is about what you're comfortable with. All languages are about what you're comfortable with. The reason one programmer programs in Python and another in PHP, or someone uses C and someone else uses C++, has everything to do with, in most cases, with what they're comfortable with. And every language is very different in terms of, you might find yourself very comfortable and enjoying the experience of programming with one language, and even if you understand it, you might find another language very tedious. And that's just the way it is. That's one of the reasons there are so many languages. Now, when you're seeing me run MySQL commands like this is a language in itself. This is SQL, which is structured query language. And there's different flavors of SQL as well. There's MySQL, there's PGSQL, there's SQLite, a lot of different flavors, which all have the gist of how they do things more or less is the same, but they also have a lot of variance as well. No, this is going to definitely be open-ended. I think that I could probably keep this going for years and not cover everything. There's a wealth of information. But I do think that realistically, maybe 6 months into these lessons, someone who's been following for those 6 months will probably be in a position that they can go out and build their own stuff. Maybe even sooner. 6 months might be pessimistic on my part. It depends on how quick everything can go through. But it's a lot of information we'll be going through. And the idea here is to actually really teach what you use as a developer. And you know, I could show a book on MySQL that's 500 pages, and in the day-to-day process of actually being a web developer, you're probably going to use 10 of those pages. So it's a lot of times more realistic to see a wide range of technologies from a bird's eye view than it is to see all of those technologies in extreme depth. I don't think there's many people who do that, unless you've just been doing it for many years, and then it just kind of happens because you use it so much. But that's kind of the idea, and I don't plan to stop it at the end of 6 months, but I think 6 months is a rough idea on my part of when I think someone starting with no prior experience will probably be able to go out and build stuff. And no, I have not. I don't think anyways. That name doesn't sound familiar. What is it? Ah, I see. Well, there's actually another alternative to Screen, which is Tmux. And that's nice too. I'm more used to Screen, although Tmux has some features that I like. For example, being able to split the screens easier. But there you go. And thank you for your offer. I'll keep that in mind if I'm in Texas. Anyone else have any questions? Yep, same time next week, and we'll just keep it on going. Now, does everyone agree with the once a week on Saturday? Is that time good for everyone? Would anyone like me to make any changes to when we do this? I'm pretty flexible on my side. Okay, excellent. So then that will conclude this session, and I will probably be putting this on YouTube sometime tomorrow. Meanwhile, though, if anyone has any questions, between now and the next session, feel free to send me a message on Reddit, or you can also, of course, join the chat room that I have at Computer Science for Everyone. And there you go. I hope everyone enjoyed this, and see you next week.